what we were looking for was a balance where we celebrated the world and all the wonders of the world, but we also did not turn away from the challenges and the worries that we have about the world. And we often said that putting together a magazine was like a symphony where you had louder passages, quieter passages, faster passages, slower, etc. And in an issue in National Geographic magazine, if it becomes way skewed to worry, then that's problematic. But if you don't address the worries, you are, I think, to some degree, ignoring your responsibilities as a journalist to point out issues and to give voice to disenfranchised people in some cases, or disenfranchised landscapes, or disenfranchised wildlife species.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has the goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. A question that I've been asked a few times regarding my deep dives into environmental topics, especially after the release of the Forever Chemicals podcast, is how do you manage to continue to cover such dark, depressing, or even scary topics? And I sometimes answer something along the lines of that they're an important story and someone has to tell them, and many of them have a silver lining or like a hope or healing of repairing. And while I don't have quite the perfect answer to that question yet, when I watched the new documentary titled The Wonder and the Worry, I can confidently say that I felt seen, or at the very least, like others understood this internal battle that many storytellers experience.
I was doing my last story for National Geographic when she was 10 years old. She just started picking up my cameras. At age 29, she's a lot better photographer than I was at age 29.
He never took on that persona like he's a big shot.
He was the best editor National Geographic ever had.
We tell meaningful stories in unforgettable ways. That's what we do.
I absolutely think that storytelling can still make a difference.
It was and still is the gold standard for photography and photojournalism.
It's the most meaningful editorial publication I've ever shot for, kind of by a lot.
You cannot predict it. There's no formula for what's going to be great.
There is need, there is crisis, and there is hope. You can save the planet with photography.
What you carry with you when you see trauma, when you see disturbing things, over the course of your career, actually, I found to become cumulative and almost more difficult because there's a repetition to the sadness.
He gave his life to photojournalism. He really did.
My role now is to help train the next generation of storytellers.
There is wonder in storytelling, whether it's through words, film, photography, music, dance, painting. Any form of art requires a deep wonder and admiration for that subject or muse. And growing up in a world plagued by a climate crisis, there's still this immense worry, specifically environmental worry. So how can we grapple with both the wonder and the worry within our world of telling stories? So how can we grapple with both this wonder and this worry within our world of telling stories? For episode 141 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, I had the pleasure of sitting down and learning from Chris Johns and his daughter, Louise Johns, to hear how they balance both the wonder in photojournalism and the worry, not only within the natural world, but also in the world of media. The first photographer to be named editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, Chris Johns served as the 9th editor-in-chief of the iconic magazine from January 2005 to April 2014, an era marked by 23 prestigious National Magazine Awards from the American Society of Magazine Editors. In 2008, Chris was named Magazine Editor of the Year. In 2008, Chris was named Magazine Editor of the Year, and in 2011, National Geographic was named Magazine of the Year. Following his role as Editor-in-Chief, Chris led the organization as Chief Content Officer and directed a major initiative called Beyond Yellowstone, a multi-year project to document the health of America's first national park. A native of Oregon, Chris currently resides with his family in Missoula, Montana, where he teaches journalism at the University of Montana and Oregon State University. Louise Johns is an independent photojournalist and documentary photographer with a master's degree in environmental science journalism from the University of Montana. A National Geographic explorer, her work examines the relationships between people, place, and animals, with a particular focus on rural communities in the American West. She began documenting the landscapes and people of the American West while working as a horse wrangler in Montana's Centennial Valley. Her work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including the New York Times, National Geographic, the Washington Post, Geo, the Nature Conservancy, Patagonia, and High Country News. Her work has been exhibited regionally and internationally and has won international awards. In addition to her photojournalism work, she teaches photography. She is a fellow with International League of Conservation Photographers, a member of Women Photograph, and has a TEDx talk called Seeing with Heart. She lives in Montana, where she pursues stories that help her understand the place she calls home. So thank you both for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today, Chris and Louise. I am excited to chat with two other journalists and learn a little bit more about both of your careers and kind of the current media landscape that we are all facing. So I think to start, if you could both just introduce yourselves for the listeners and then explain what specifically drew you to photojournalism and using photography as a method of storytelling.
Dad, you go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Lou. Well, I grew up in Southern Oregon, and I knew early in my life that I was going to be a large animal vet. So I went to Oregon State University to do that, and I took a journalism class because I thought it would be an easy A. I could raise my GPA so I could get into vet school. And I had this incredible professor who changed the course of my career and really changed the course of my life. So I started in journalism, and then I took a photography class shortly after that, and I just thought that was magic. And became really interested in photography and combining the photography and the journalism into photojournalism. And this was at a time too, during Watergate and a lot of really important things happening in journalism and holding people accountable for their behavior, most notably President Nixon. And then in Oregon, there was a quite a healthy environmental movement too, which I was really interested in. So that all made me convinced that the career for me was in journalism, especially photojournalism.
And my career also didn't start. My career in photojournalism also didn't start until college. I was an avid equestrian horseback rider my whole childhood, and total animal lover, horsewoman. But I, of course, had grown up with my dad, who throughout my childhood, took us on trips with him as he did his work, mostly when I was kind of under the age of 10, 12. So some real formative years in my childhood. And a lot of those trips were to Southern Africa, where he was working with wild animals like wild dogs and cheetahs. And I think when I came to the University of Montana from where I grew up in Virginia, I knew that I wanted to do something involving storytelling. Maybe, but I hadn't even considered photography. I was sort of more interested in writing. And so I took some classes at the journalism school, and, basically figured, I didn't really want to be in a newsroom. I didn't really want to be a reporter. It wasn't quite the pace for me. But I decided to take a photojournalism class, and again, as my dad said, I sort of discovered the magic of the camera in that class, and had a really good professor that helped me discover that. And I realized that I could use the camera as sort of a portal into these worlds that I really cared about, including, stories about animals and stories about people's relationships with animals. And I realized that that was a really powerful tool for me to express my voice and the things that I cared about. So that's kind of how it began for me. And then, of course, I realized over time how influenced I was by my father's career and the impact of traveling with him as a young child, and sort of being immersed in it through sort of through osmosis, almost through just being part of his family.
Yeah, I think it is pretty clear you both are very passionate photojournalists, and kind of came to learning about that and implementing it in your life in a very organic way. And in your new documentary that you guys produced together, The Wonder and the Worry, that is kind of a story that's interwoven into the film, and kind of overviews your guys' background and the impact that storytelling and journalism can have on the world. And so if we're kind of looking back over your careers and kind of your general passions at the current moment, why do you think that we as humans are drawn to telling stories and also listening to stories?
Well, it's an organic part of our nature. That's it started probably even before campfires, or certainly around campfires. And that's how we learn. That's how we relate. That's how we discover that, it feeds our sense of curiosity. It brings us together. It's a great social enterprise, and it helps us realize who we are, where we came from, and hopefully where we're going. So now what's interesting is that there are all these different tools to make storytelling even more powerful and even more interesting, more platforms to do it. And with that comes challenges, but I think for the most part, it's very positive. So it's moved from those campfire conversations in a small community now to podcasts, to evolve with the printing press, and then television and radio, and all these tools now we have, especially as photojournalists, where we can capture audio, we can capture still pictures, and we can capture video, all through the same tool. And then we've got all these different platforms, especially online, that we can use to reach more and more people. But like I say, and we can talk about this later if you like, but there's, that's also really presented some challenges, especially relative to reliability and accuracy on those platforms, and what a lot of people are saying.
Yeah,
Louise,
I'll just add, stories are and have always been for as long as humans have existed. Their stories are our lives, and our lives are full of stories. And so, it's how we communicate is through story. And indigenous cultures have been doing this for thousands of years, and we have too in our modern cultures. And so and one of my mentors described storytelling once as completely nonlinear. Stories are living. They're not ever, there's one point where it starts and one point where it ends. I mean, it's these issues we talk about and how we talk about ourselves is constantly changing. And I just think there's a lot of wisdom in that. But when we think about journalism, how over time, the stories we do in journalism do provide a record of history, and then that just continues to move forward.
Absolutely. And Chris, you kind of alluded to this in your last response, but when it comes to journalism, there are a lot of different forms, and you both gravitated towards photojournalism. And so why do you think that photography is such an impactful form of storytelling? And I guess videography as well.
Well, if it's done well and it's done by responsible people, it can be evidence, it can be documentation, it can be reality. And if it's done really well, pictures can be made that stand the test of time and help us understand, help us see, and can be irrefutable, done well, and done by people with high journalistic values as to getting at the truth and telling the truth and not manipulating pictures, etc. And if we think about a lot of the most important moments in history, in modern history, there's often an image that helps you relate to and understand that particular moment. This whole notion of capturing moments. And to some degree, photography's been democratized with phones and everything else, but there still needs to be skilled people who are dedicated to making those images. And it's true for videography too, but there is still something about that image. I mean, let's talk for a second about the latest round of Pulitzer Prizes. The photographs that were made by Reuters photographies of Gaza simply stop you in your tracks. And you have time to look at that image and what it means to humanity, what it means to the people who are in that image. The same's true with Associated Press Pulitzer Prize winners, with their coverage of the border. And you start to understand, and you start hopefully to care, and you can reflect on that image. You can spend time with that image and let it soak in. And it can reach an intellectual level and reach an emotional level. So yes, photography is changing, but when it's done well and when it's done with the highest journalistic principles, it's an incredibly powerful medium for us to help understand each other and understand the world.
Yeah, I echo all of that, and just it's a bit of a cliche, but photography is a universal language. It has the ability to convey what words can't, and to bring us close to things that seem far away. And I think that it also has the ability to reflect people back to themselves, and reflect situations that, whether it's what my dad just mentioned in terms of the photographs of Gaza, reflect back to the world what's happening there. And that's incredibly important, and will never not be important.
Yeah, and current events, they are often what is driving the media in terms of storytelling, I think. But from your perspectives, what do you think is what draws you to a story and then kind of justifies it in your mind as, yes, this is a story that needs to be told and more people need to see and need to understand this?
Lou, why don't you take the first crack at that one?
Well, I think
That's a great question.
I mean, I tend to work on longer, the stories that I choose to work on are longer, more in-depth projects. And I think it's typically, what makes a great story is basically complexity, nuance, emotion, an element of timelessness. That's it, in general. When you talk about storytelling, not just in journalism, I think that those are some of the things that make a really good story, and then good characters. I mean, for me, what makes I'm drawn to stories about how humans interact with their environment and how we relate to what our relationships are with animals and wildlife, how we live with wildlife, how we live within the natural world, and so when I choose or am drawn to working on a particular story, it's usually because of a person I've met or a situation I've been exposed to, or an experience I've been exposed to, that sparks something in me that makes me want to, sparks a curiosity in me that makes me want to learn more. And but again, it's those qualities of nuance, complexity, and of course emotion, because emotion is really what makes a great photograph.
Yeah, I think Louise said it well. I mean, I would say too that complexity and layers, and that's analogous to a story and a single image. A great photograph usually has layers to it. That there may be sort of layers of discovery where you see the first impression of the picture, and then you see that the picture has layers that you maybe didn't see on that first glance, and draws you and keeps you there and makes you think about what's in the photograph and maybe the bigger issues in life that the photograph addresses. The other thing that helps in storytelling is tension, and I want to talk about that for a minute, because a lot of stories, and Louise and I see this a lot in rural America, because we both grew up in rural America. I've lived in rural America. I live in Missoula, Montana, on the edge of town, and Louise does too, but she does a lot of work, as I've done a lot of work in rural America, and not just rural America, but actually rural places throughout the world. And a lot of journalistic coverage comes across as conflict between city people and rural people, an urban rural divide, conflict with wild animals especially in rural situations, conflict with each other, et cetera, et cetera. And more often than not, that's just an easy, lazy narrative. It's usually, as Louise just mentioned, it's usually much more interesting, and it's much more complicated than that. But having said that, there can be tension in the story, and the tension can be a powerful element to propel and deepen the narrative. But tension is not to be confused with conflict, because conflict starts to connotate that there's winners and losers, and that it's simple, and it's seldom simple. And when it is simple, or if it's presented as simple, it's boring. But tension, how we work together to solve major problems that we face everyone faces in the world, regardless if you're in suburbia, urban, or a rural environment. The other thing I think that Louise and I both um, really enjoy about journalism is stories that have a new angle, that just aren't retreads of what you read all the time in the mainstream media, but are very important in people's lives and very important for all of our future.
Yeah, and that piece of, I guess, standing out or creating an original story that really kind of hits those points that you're both talking about, I think can be a real challenge when people are trying to make a living and a career out of any form of media or journalism. And I myself, as a freelancer, have faced several challenges over the last few years, as I think many other freelancers have. And so, from your perspectives, how has the media landscape changed from when you started working in this field of journalism and kind of evolved?
Well, I'll speak to that first because in my career, which spans now more than 50 years, it's changed a lot. When I came out of grad school at the University of Minnesota, the logical step for people in photojournalism, there were exceptions to this, but more often than not, the logical career trajectory was to start at newspapers, small. I mean, you worked as a student. When I was at Oregon State too, I worked at the Oregon State University Daily Barometer, and then I worked at smaller newspapers in Oregon, and then went to grad school and worked at the student newspaper some, and then had an internship at the Topeka Capital Journal in Topeka, Kansas, which at the time was one of the best medium-sized newspapers in the country for a photojournalist to work for, and then took leave of absences from that position and did a story for National Geographic, and then went to the Seattle Times and photographed there, especially a lot for their Sunday magazine. Took another leave of absence, worked for National Geographic, and sort of worked my way up through the ranks to National Geographic, and freelanced for Time and Newsweek and People and other magazines along the way. But it's much different now because a lot of those smaller and even medium-sized, and in some cases even metropolitan newspapers have shrunk or disappeared. And so you don't have sort of the mentoring process that we used to have, which was wonderful. It was delightful. And as in our film, Jimmy Chin puts it really well, yeah, you pay your dues, but love paying your dues. And I have to say that I loved paying my dues. I loved working at newspapers, and I love freelancing. But Louise has come into a world that's much different. And Louise, you've handled it and continue to handle that really well. Why don't you speak to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious now that how much less local news there is, and so for a photojournalist, there are less opportunities to take that path of working at local newspapers and actually trying to make a living, because either they don't have staff photographers or there's no longer a local newspaper. And so really, for most of us, the only option is freelancing. So, like for me living in Montana, and I've chosen to stay in Montana because I love it here. And I met my husband here and we live here, now. So in some ways it's even harder in a place like rural Montana to make a living as only a journalist. But I've found myself working in photography in other ways, like doing commercial work and working for nonprofits and foundations. And you just I've just been able to broaden the types of photography that I do, not just to strictly journalism. And that's been really important. But I think that also this sort of demise of local news has also really hurt our country and hurt journalism, because there's not a trusted local news source for people in these really remote, isolated places to get their news, and so they rely on Fox News or MSNBC, or these big national news outlets that aren't really invested in the communities, and that when they do come to these communities, they're usually parachuting in, and they don't really understand the place. And so for me, it's been important for me to stay in this place that I care about in Montana, and be a freelancer who they can call on, who does understand these communities, because I've been here for 14 years now. And I think that's really important, to have freelance photographers or journalists who are immersed and invested in their communities. And that's not to say I don't go do work other places, and that's not also important, but yeah, I mean, we all know how polarized our media landscape is in this country, and how polarized we are as a nation, and those two go hand in hand.
Yeah, and the polarization, like you were mentioning, is kind of leading to a relatively fractured landscape, and it's kind of difficult to find your place and find your footing, especially if you're just entering the world of journalism, or you left a staff job and now you're a freelancer. There are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of layoffs happening, and just a lot of stress in media that I have picked up on in the last few years. And so, how have you found success in navigating that fractured landscape?
I mean, I don't know if it, I've never really thought about like being I haven't really thought about it in that frame, I guess. But I think just doing the best that we can, and having the most integrity in the work that we're doing, and listening to people. I mean, I guess, and also figuring out, if I'm pitching a story to an outlet, figuring out who is my audience, and where's the best place for this story to land, where it's going to have impact with maybe people that don't understand this community that I'm working with. And I think that, like, thinking in those terms can help maybe bridge some divides when you have, again, just going back to journalists working in places that they're invested in and have worked in for a long time. But I mean, I think, yeah, I guess it depends how you define success too, because a lot of people see the New York Times or the Washington Post as liberal outlets, and don't want to. I just recently worked on a story where they were very skeptical of the Washington Post, and it was really only because of both me and the other organization that I was working with to get access, that they talked to the Post. And that's just one example. I'm not calling out the Washington Post, but they do great work. But it's really hard to navigate a fractured media landscape, and I guess it just depends on who you're trying to reach.
Yeah, Chris, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, to me, to answer that really good question, Meg, there's really kind of two parts to the fracturing problem. One is the one that Louise addressing, which is, it's become increasingly difficult to make a living, because you don't have as many outlets that subscribe to high journalistic standards. I mean, there's a lot of noise out there, and there's a lot of agendas out there, and there's a lot of support for those agendas, but it has little or anything to do with journalism. And So that's made it tough to be a journalist, to make a living being a journalist. And as Louise said, it's not exclusive of the Washington Post at all. It's because of this fractured landscape and a proliferation of misinformation. Let's be honest. Let's call what it is. It's misinformation. It's misinformation with agendas in many cases. And it could be a liberal agenda, and it could be a conservative agenda, it could be an extreme agenda, etc. But the other thing that keeps me fired up every day and makes me want to continue to teach young journalists at the University of Montana and Oregon State is the impact of all of that fracturedness, if there is such a word, on the community. And that's of a big concern because there are people who want to sow discontent, and there can be foreign agents who are doing that. We know Putin has a hand in that. We know Chinese. That's that's factual. But there are also people who sow discontent and take advantage of the fracturedness we're talking about to pursue power and to pursue their own agendas. And that's really hard on communities, especially as Louise said, there's not a trusted news source or something in storytelling that brings people together. And that doesn't mean that everybody has to agree, but there are respectful parts of a conversation that need to be respected, and name calling and belittling and meanness and anger and stoking fear are really concern me in communities, be it a rural community or an urban community. And that's why it's so important for us to figure out ways and be creative about how we support good, reliable, high value journalism, so we can differentiate between misinformation and agendas and draw together as a community and solve problems together.
Yeah, it does feel like when there is that agenda and polarization that they're kind of just copping out to capitalize on the conflict that already exists and be like, how can we stoke this fire and get more clicks and get more views and get more discourse and all of these things, instead of getting to the root of that story and like the truth that is behind it all. And so when you are pitching a story or identifying a story, just kind of like in your daily life and in your work, how have you been able to push through that to actually tell impactful stories and ones that you feel are making a difference in your community and the greater media landscape?
Well, the first thing I'm going to address on that is I'm going to go back to my career for a second, and I think Louise can address it too, but I think it holds true to her too. There was a reason that I eventually moved on from newspapers, which I loved, and I worked for some really good newspapers when newspapers were healthy, and eventually went to work for National Geographic, and that was basically because of time. Because what the National Geographic would do it would give me time, and it would give me the opportunity to not come in with any kind of agenda, or hopefully, it would mitigate biases I might have. And I could be curious, and that's one of the strongest elements a journalist can have. I don't come in to cover a story judgmentally. I come in because I'm curious, and if it's a story that is polarizing or has a great deal of conflict, my questions are going to be, well, how did it come to this? And, how do we tell the story? So I just want to make the point that when journalists are rushed, when they have to bounce, as Louise said earlier, parachute and bounce from story to story, I'm really uncomfortable with that. So how, as a journalist, do you do it? Well, Louise and I have done it through personal projects that, we might spend years working on, and occasionally have assignments that supplement it. But it's what you care about. And this gets to the point of, as a journalist, you having a voice and developing a voice. And years ago, I asked my dear friend, the wonderful author David Quammen, what's voice? And David said, well, voice is deep character. It's what you really care about, and why you're in journalism, why you're so driven passionately to tell stories and to try to get those stories journalistically right. And so, when you have a strong voice, what you're able to do is amplify the voice of others. And in Louise's case, that could be the Blackfoot Nation. It could be other indigenous groups in the Pacific Northwest or the Northwest. I mean, that's something she started in grad school and still carries on with. And then, but it takes time to do that. And you have to be creative, not only in just how you tell a story, but even getting there to tell a story. And I'm really proud of Louise because she's figured out a lot of ways to do that without compromising herself, her voice, and a strength in her voice and her character. So, Lou, why don't you talk about some of the things that you've done very successfully like that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add, back to other ways that the media has changed in my career, and I guess from the span of my dad's career to mine, is that there's not the time that magazines are giving us anymore for stories. I mean, from my dad's era to mine, there is, even with National Geographic, absolutely not the kind of time and it's because there's not the budgets for it. And so, there are a lot of opportunities in grants and there's a lot of photography grants out there. So as photographers, we're lucky that we have access to that. Although those are also very competitive. So you're kind of like constantly balancing like how much time you put into a story. And I think that's, again, where personal projects in my career have been so important, and the amount of time I've put into projects just simply because I care about them, not because I'm making any kind of living off of it. That's what really drives me. And then eventually that hard work, I think, does pay off for people, and you get a grant, or you get published somewhere that lifts you up just a little bit more. But yeah, and then just in terms of navigating the fractured media landscape, again, having expertise in an area, so in a place or an area, or and there's many photographers that I know and look up to that have worked in Africa, and they know how to get access. They know how to navigate some of those incredibly dangerous situations. They know, they understand how things work there. And so I think that it's really important to have, again, and it goes with developing your voice, but what do you care about, and what places do you care about? Where do you want to invest your time, instead of like bouncing all over to these different quick little projects, or, just that are sort of just getting lost in the news cycle. I think it's really important to sort of ground yourself in a place or an area of expertise that can help you really develop a project that then helps you develop your voice and continue on. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of having a niche, as some people say in the industry, of like, this is like my primary focus and what I want to build my portfolio and my life around. If you've enjoyed listening to this interview and any of our other interviews on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we'd love to hear from you. One super easy and free way to support our content is by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. We thank you for listening to and supporting our work so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. Through this whole conversation and also in your documentary, there is a lot of discourse about how much passion you have for photojournalism, but also how many concerns you have about the state of the world and the state of journalism as a whole. And the title is The Wonder and the Worry. And so I guess I'm curious as to what that means to you and why that became the focus of this specific project.
Well, I can take that one. To kind of give you a nuts and bolts answer at first. The way the movie came about was I was asked to speak several times at my alma mater, Oregon State University. And one of the classes I spoke to, I directly addressed the wonder and the worry on several levels. One was when I was editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, we talked about it all the time because we were putting together issues of a magazine that would be, of course, expressed online as well. And what we were looking for was a balance where we celebrated the world and all the wonders of the world, but we also did not turn away from the challenges and the worries that we have about the world. And we often said that putting together a magazine was like a symphony where you had louder passages, quieter passages, faster passages, slower, etc. And in an issue in National Geographic magazine, if it becomes way skewed to worry, then that's problematic. But if you don't address the worries, you are, I think, to some degree, ignoring your responsibilities as a journalist to point out issues and to give voice to disenfranchised people in some cases, or disenfranchised landscapes, or disenfranchised wildlife species. So that conversation I had with students at Oregon State provided the seeds for the film. The other thing I would say on a much more personal level, which is addressed in the film, is in 2016, when I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. That was a diagnosis that most people don't want to hear, and I'm very sympathetic to that. And I had to really look at my life and muster all the strength my family and I could give and friends could give to help me get through that. And a really important way for me to get through that treatment was to focus a lot on the wonder and be very positive about the world and positive about my life. And I think that is a healthy way to live. Now, again, that doesn't mean you turn away from confronting the problems humanity faces, but it does mean that you are optimistic, positive, and working to celebrate the wonders and to seek solutions. So that's kind of where the film title came from, and I think it's a pretty good prescription for life too.
Yeah, I mean that pretty much sums it up. I had heard that phrase first from my dad, the wonder and the worry, and then the filmmaker David Baker decided to to name the film that, which I think is very appropriate. But I mean, I think of it too, like you can't, with wonder and worry, you can't have one without the other. You don't know one without the other. And so there's that constant tension in our lives, in storytelling. And you know, they both kind of hold equal weight because of that. And it's never just one or the other. They're both constantly there.
There is a lot that you both could continue to discuss and share with all of us. And I've already learned so much from both of you in just this short conversation. But how can listeners learn more about both of you, the work that you're doing, and also hopefully check out the Wonder and the Worry documentary when it is available?
You know, you can get a good hint by just simply searching online the Wonder and the Worry film trailer, and you can at least get a taste of the film in that trailer. I would highly recommend that people go to Louise's social media account or Instagram account, her website. You can see a lot of Louise's work. And you know, I think you'll find that wonderful. You know, you can search me and you can find quite a few of my pictures on online. I don't have nearly as robust a website or anything as Louise does. Like I say, most of my energy goes to teaching journalism students. So, you know, like I say, at the University of Montana and Oregon State University, but there's lots of good journalism schools out there that are doing great work.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be sure to share the trailer in the show notes, and then also Louise's links to her Instagram and her website. And if by July there is more information about where to get the documentary and things like that, then I'll be sure to include that. But are there any, I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but are there any other parts or specific things weighing on your mind that you want to be sure are included?
Boy, I mean, from my perspective, this has been a wonderful conversation. Meg, great, insightful questions. You know, I think it's important, just as Louise said a minute ago, to keep that perspective of wonder and worry. And I really encourage people to support local journalism and to support students who are trying to become journalists, and support good, high journalistic storytelling, and really think about, you know, where you get information, and be discerning about the information you get. You know, of course, I'm a news junkie, you know, like most journalists are, but I read all different kinds of outlets and platforms, and I would just encourage people to be open, to be curious, to reach out to all different kinds of sources of storytelling and great journalism, and support it, because our society, all of us, are going to be a lot healthier with that support.
Louise, do you have anything you want to add?
I mean, not really. I really agree with that. You asked, I think, one question in your list on advice for storytellers, which I don't like giving advice because everyone's path is different, and it's just I don't feel like I am of this stature to give advice. But I guess some of the most important things that I've learned through my experience and through mentors, through wonderful mentors that I've been lucky to have, is listening is the most important skill we can develop as storytellers. And, with that being patient and never being above anything or anyone or if my local newspaper asks me to do a story and I can do it, I'm going to do it. I'm not better than that, because we need good storytelling on all fronts, and I think it's just really important for us as storytellers, journalists, to remain humble and remember why we do what we do. And then just all the mentors that I've had, and I think they know who they are. My dad is one, but I've been really lucky to have amazing mentors, and that's one of the most important things that a young, aspiring, emerging photojournalist can have. And then again, listening to them. So finding a good mentor and listening to them. So those are just some things that I kind of reflected on as you asked as you emailed that question.
Absolutely. Mentors are so important, at least I have found in my work, and definitely an essential piece of growing as a person and in your career. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.